Hi everyone, welcome to Keep It Casual, a video tutorial series featuring clean and simple card making. I'm Andrea, owner of Paper Crafters Library and Andrea Walford Designs. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to create this Joyful Wishes card featuring Lawn Fawn's Joy to the Woods stamp set and coordinating craft dies. So I started off by choosing this really pretty piece of pattern paper from Lawn Fawn's Snow Day 6x6 Petite Paper Pack. And I chose that because I really liked the effect of the falling snow on the pattern. And I decided to enhance that and make that look a little bit more dimensional by applying some of my white Wendy Vecchi embossing paste through my Simon Says Stamp Falling Snow stencil. Now you can see that I've held my stencil in place with a little bit of painter's tape, and I'm using a small plastic palette knife to scrape a very thin layer of the embossing paste onto my stencil, and then just removing the excess and putting it back into my container. Now, a quick note when you're working with embossing paste and stencils, you don't want to let that embossing paste dry on the stencil. What I usually do is keep a tub filled with water beside my workspace, and then when I'm done with my stencil, I just dump it in there until I have time to clean it. So now here, once I carefully peel away my stencil from my pattern paper piece, you can see that beautiful texture left behind by the embossing paste. Now, one of my favorite techniques when I'm working with my embossing paste through my stencils is to actually apply some embossing glitter over top. So here you can see I'm applying my clear sparkle embossing glitter from Wow embossing powder. And I really like this because in addition to the dimension created by the embossing paste, you've now got the glitter created by the embossing glitter. So I've held my paper over top of a coffee filter, sprinkled my embossing powder on top, and then that way with the coffee filter I can very carefully funnel it back into my container. Now when heating the embossing glitter on the embossing paste, you do want to make sure you heat it only enough to melt the embossing glitter. Don't get too close or hold the heat tool over it for too long because you can actually end up causing the embossing paste to bubble. So once I know my embossing powder is completely melted, I then set the piece aside to allow my embossing paste time to air dry. So I have here a piece of 80-pound Neenah Solar White cardstock that is 4 1/4 inches wide. And I'm taking two of the dies that come from my Simon Says Stamped Stitched Slopes and Hills. And I've got one of the stitch dies and the solid cut line die that coordinates with that. And you can see I have them layered one on top of the other. And then I have them positioned up from the bottom at about the height that I want my first slope to be. And then I'm holding it in place with some repositionable tape, and I'm going to run it through my Big Shot. Now, in order to cut my second slope, I took that same piece of cardstock, flipped it upside down, aligned the slope that I had just finished die cutting with the bottom edge, and then took my second set of dies from that same Stitched Slopes and Hills collection and positioned it where I thought I wanted it to be in relation to my first slope that I had die cut. Then once I had my two dies layered one on top of the other, and again, one piece, the bottom one is the stitched portion, the top one is a solid cut. So once I had them positioned exactly where I wanted them to be, I once again held them in place with my low tack repositionable tape and then ran it through my Big Shot to create my second hill. And here you can see what my two die cut hills look like. So I'm working here with my remnant piece of Neenah Solar White cardstock, and that was left over when I die cut my hills. And I'm going to be stamping my birch trees that come from the Lawn Fawn Joy to the Woods stamp set onto that piece of cardstock. Now, because I'm planning on coloring the trees in with my Copic markers, I am inking up my image with my Tuxedo Memento Black ink, which is my favorite ink when I'm coloring with Copic markers. Now, in the Joy to the Woods stamp set, there's two sets of trees. There's this double set of trees that you see me stamping here, and I went ahead and stamped that twice. And then there's also a single tree, which I stamped once. So now, because I have 5 birch trees to color, and I'm pretty much coloring them all in the same way, I thought that I'd show you in fast forward mode the coloring of one of the birch trees. Now, I'm using 3 different colors of Copic markers, W00, W3, and W6. I used my W6 Copic marker just to trace along each of the lines in the image. I'm then alternating between my W3 and W00 to color in the trunk. Now, one of the things you may notice as I'm coloring with my Copic markers is that I always go from dark to light. So I'm applying the W3 to small segments of the tree trunk and then blending it out with the W00. Now, as needed, I'm going back and adding more of each color if I feel like I need to darken up an area or I need to blend something out a little bit more. So with all 5 of my trees colored, my next step is to cut them out. And to do that, I'm using the coordinating custom craft dies from Lawn Fawn. And I'm using the double one to die cut the double tree and then the single one to die cut the single tree. I'm holding the dies in place with my repositionable tape, and then I'm die cutting them using my Big Shot. And here you can see what my die cut birch trees look like. So in addition to the birch trees, I've decided to use 2 more images that come from this same Joy to the Woods stamp set. I want to use the little cardinal and the little chipmunk. So I'm stamping them onto another scrap piece of my Neenah Solar White cardstock using my Memento Tuxedo Black ink. So I've chosen 3 different colors of Copic markers to color in the body of my cardinal, R22, R24, and R27. Now I'm following the same technique that I used when coloring in my birch trees. I'm working from my darkest color all the way to my lightest color. Now each time I move from one color to the next, I slightly overlap the strokes, and I find that that helps me get a much smoother blend. Now to color in the beak and feet, I'm only using one color, which is YR09, because the space is so small it doesn't really leave much room for blending. Now the little stripe on the back of my chipmunk I'm coloring in with E18 and E79, and then for the belly I'm using E34 and E31. Now one of the things you may notice as I'm coloring in the belly of the chipmunk is that I had to spend a lot more time blending the E31 and E34 together, and I just found that that was because there was still a little bit too much difference in between the 2 colors, so it needed more work. So with my 2 images now colored, the next step was to die cut them once again using the coordinating custom craft dies from Lawn Fawn. So as I did with the other dies, I'm just layering the die on top of the image, adding some tape to hold it in place, and running them through my Big Shot. And here you can see what my 2 die cut pieces look like. Now I decided to create my sentiment in the form of a banner, and I chose a piece of pattern paper from that same Snow Day Petite paper pack. Now the sentiment comes from the Joy to the Woods stamp set, and it says Joyful Wishes. I'm inking it up in my Ranger Jet Black archival ink and stamping it along the bottom of my 6x6 patterned paper piece. Now in order to create the banner itself, I just aligned my stamped pattern paper piece in my paper trimmer and just trimmed it so that the cut line was about an equal distance on the top as there was space on the bottom. And then once I had trimmed it, I used my paper snips to cut a fishtail at the far left side of the banner. So with all the individual elements of my card prepped, it's now time to put it together. I started off by sticking together 2 frames that I had cut using my silhouette. Both frames are 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches in dimension, and the frame itself is 1/2 inch wide. One was cut out of Neenah Solar White cardstock, and one was cut out of a piece of pattern paper from that same Snow Day Petite paper pack. I then took my pattern paper piece with the embossing paste and attached the first hill onto it. You can see I attached my hill so that it's about 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom. I then just laid the second hill directly on top of that and used it to help me position where I wanted my birch trees to be. You can see I have one set of 2 trees tucked at the back and then the other 2 at the front. Now a couple times I'll pull my frame back in for reference just so that I know where exactly I want it placed. Now my second hill I ended up positioning so that it was about 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge of my pattern paper piece. And then both hills were stuck down using my Tombow Mono multi-liquid glue, and any excess from the hills and from the birch trees were then trimmed off using the edges of my pattern paper piece as a guide. Now here I'm just putting some dimensional foam on the back of my frame so I can adhere it onto my card front. So now once my pattern paper piece was assembled, it was time to stick it to the front of my card. Now there I have a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card that I created out of a 4 1/4 by 11 inch piece of 120 pound Simon Says cardstock. I stuck my pattern paper panel down using my Tombow Mono multi-liquid glue. Then I peeled the backing off of the dimensional foam from my window frame and stuck that directly over top. Now the remaining elements, so the chipmunk, the cardinal, and then my banner, I attached onto my card using that same Tombow Mono multi-liquid glue. So now the last couple things I did to my card were to add a few rhinestones there on the far right. You can see I added 3 rhinestones, one above the other. And then I took my W00 Copic marker just to add a little bit of shading underneath the chipmunk, so to make it look like the chipmunks cast shadow on the snow. It just makes the scene look a little bit more realistic by giving it some more dimension. So that's how I created my Joyful Wishes card featuring Lawn Fawn's Joy to the Woods stamp set and coordinating craft dies. I hope you enjoyed today's video tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Keep It Casual.